One of my Patreon members, Cultists, they asked about something I wanted to cover and open with anyway, and that is your reaction to this ICC arrest warrant. So the International Criminal Court, the latest news is that they have issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin and another Russian official as part of what they are calling child kidnapping. They're accusing them of kidnapping children from Ukraine and forcibly emigrating them to Russia. Now, what is your take on this? Because not only has Vladimir Putin and the Russian government and the Russian side said this has no jurisdiction over Russia. We do not recognize this legally. But so has the United States. The United States has said this is justified in the sense that they agree with the basis behind it, but they also, Joe Biden's administration is very clear, they also do not recognize this legally per se. So what's your take on this? This is a pretty interesting story, also kind of bizarre, but I'd like to know your reaction.
Well, it's bizarre because the West is resorting to increasingly desperate measures to try to gain some sort of leverage over the situation. Their own proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, the International Criminal Court, nobody takes that seriously. It's one of these so-called international institutions that are created by the West, for the West. The Western nations themselves using it against nations that they target don't adhere to it and are not subjected to it. The United States has committed the worst violations of human rights in the 21st century. And where's the ICC in regards to, say, the U.S. invasion of Iraq or Libya or Syria or Afghanistan? Nowhere to be found. So it's impossible to take it seriously. It has no credibility. It has no jurisdiction. So what is it? It's just a giant PR move. And we saw them kind of trying to build this over the last couple of months, these claims that Russia is kidnapping children. I mean, they're moving people out of an active war zone, which is actually their responsibility under international law to actually do that. And so it's again, it's the world upside down. The West is trying to penalize Russia for upholding its obligations under international law in armed warfare. You're supposed to remove the civilian population. So the whole thing makes no sense. But what else can they do?
Yeah, I mean, this is very true. And one of the interesting things about this is that there was a conflict during the Trump administration with the ICC. The Trump administration said, we don't recognize this body. We're not going to be a party to it. It's not as if Joe Biden has actually reversed that policy anyhow, which I think is by design, and that's why they don't recognize it. But again, the hypocrisy is pretty clear. Vladimir Putin is being targeted here, yet, I mean, the United States is a party to war crimes in Ukraine and elsewhere. Could you talk about that? Could you talk about what is the United States party to here? Because it seems to me when it comes to places like Bakhmut and when it comes to just how involved the United States has been when it comes to all of the casualties, whether they're civilian or military, the United States has a huge role to play here.
They do. I mean, this would not be going on right now if it wasn't for the United States sending weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. This would have ended a long time ago. But as a matter of fact, this wouldn't even have started. The United States is at the very center of this entire conflict because it was in 2014 when the U.S. itself overthrew the elected government, put a quiet regime into power, and sent this catastrophe down the path to where it is right now. They overthrew a sovereign government. That is utterly illegal. Is done in contravention to the UN Charter. Its guarantees of political independence, the prohibition against political interference in another nation's internal political affairs. The U.S. is trampled all over international law. And you don't even need the ICC to deal with that. The UN should deal with it, but it's not going to because unfortunately at the moment, if you don't have a proper balance of power globally, these international institutions will just be hijacked by whoever has the most power, which unfortunately is still the United States and the collective West. So this wouldn't even be happening if it wasn't for the United States. And then for them to turn it turn it completely around and aim it at Russia when they started this whole thing very deliberately. There again, we've talked about this, Daddy. The policy papers, the U.S. Think tanks talked about how they were going to do this to extend Russia, to draw them into a costly conflict. And so here's the conflict. It's premeditated, and they did it openly, signed and dated policy papers.
Yeah. And so, in the wake of this ICC decision too, I mean, to issue an arrest warrant. I mean, I'm wondering about not only the arrest warrant for Biden, but how about people like Olaf Scholz who presided over likely, or at least we have we have huge reason to believe that, Chancellor Olaf Scholz in Germany, perhaps many other, Norway, for example, the political leadership in Norway had deep knowledge of what was one of the biggest crimes of this conflict, which is the destruction of Nord Stream, which now has not gotten any attention really in the mainstream Western media, collective West mainstream media. But despite everything that's happened since then, it still hasn't gotten any attention. There's been calls for investigations. There was a UN Security Council hearing on this, and yet the United States keeps whistling by it.
But I mean, the impunity, the hypocrisy was always there. This so-called rules-based international order the U.S. presides over. But because it's in decline and things are not going the way they want, it's becoming desperate. And this whole process, the hypocrisy, the sense of impunity that they enjoy, it's becoming more and more obvious. And they're less concerned with covering it up and maintaining the illusion of some sort of international law that they're adhering to or upholding. That they can't afford to do that right now. And they're just scrambling from one thing to the next, and it's becoming more obvious to more and more people. Even just ordinary people are wondering what's going on. And I mean, if they ruled out Russia didn't blow up the pipeline, who does that leave? That means someone in the West or allied to the West did it.
Well, they're saying now, I know you've seen the reports on what U.S. intelligence is saying about a pro-Ukrainian group using a yacht. Unclear where, how they were able to get the means to do all of this, but that's who they're blaming now. Some unknown pro-Ukrainian group. What has been your take? Could you talk about that a bit? Your take on this? What has been said now that there has been some damage control attempted by the United States around Nord Stream? Because it feels like also the ICC arrest warrant, a lot of this is damage control. The U.S. isn't a party to the ICC, but the U.S. surely has a huge influence over it. And all of this feels like damage control and ramping up the propaganda war to do that.
Well, just a note on the ICC. Yes, the United States uses it all the time. They put pressure on the ICC to go after all nations that are targeted by the U.S. for being undermined or for regime change. So I think that's very important to understand. It doesn't sign on to it officially. It's not subject to it, but they're more than happy to use it. It's a weapon. It's lawfare. It's part of U.S. lawfare, essentially. Regarding the pipeline, this ridiculous conspiracy theory that they've spun up, people looking at that conspiracy theory are left even more certain that what investigative journalist Seymour Hersh wrote about how it actually most likely took place. I mean, they walk away more certain that is the actual way it unfolded versus this ridiculous story about a yacht where people started pointing out, well, the weight of the like they didn't even think about this when they were making up this story. The weight of the explosives are just too much. So then they started saying, well, maybe they did it in trips, or maybe it's not. Okay, maybe it wasn't a yacht. Maybe it was a tanker. I mean, this is like this is childish and embarrassing, and this is what the leadership of the collective West and the media are. Well, some of them are starting to kind of question it, but still far too many people in far too high positions are trying to push this seriously.
Yeah, and in all of it reminds me, it's kind of like you said, turning the world upside down or on its head. This almost feels like turning the kind of lies we've seen over and over again on their head, meaning instead of them preemptively or maybe predating interventionism in war, like the lies around weapons of mass destruction or Gaddafi and Viagra and all of those kind of lies, rather than doing that, as you're moving into escalation after escalation, it's now damage control. These kind of lies are now damage control around things like the Nord Stream attack, because it's absolutely absurd. It reminds me of how the Syrian rebels, quote unquote, were being portrayed, no matter what kind of weaponry they were touting and how big and how many times they would splinter and be seen with US officials like John McCain, etc. No matter how many times that happened, they were still portrayed and constantly portrayed as, oh, well, they're just Syrian civilians who've joined a cause to free the country from Assad. And that was just hammered in over and over and over again. It feels like they're trying to grab onto that in this moment. But unlike in Syria, now you had someone like Seymour Hersh, one of the most credible journalists of all time, literally expose how this happened, and the damage control just isn't as effective.
You're right, and that's a good point. That they're lying as a means of damage control rather than as a means of advancing their foreign policy objectives. I mean, we remember back in Syria from 2011 onward. I think at the time there wasn't much collective awareness, not as much as there is now. I think more and more people are starting to wake up to what's going on. And again, it all goes back to the emergence of multipolarism, and what multipolarism is in essence is alternatives. There's alternatives to the monopolies that the West has controlled for generations, really. And among those alternatives includes all kinds of media that people are tuning into because they're tired of being lied to. And when they see a story this ridiculous, it just reinforces in their mind how big the problem actually is and how necessary it is to seek out alternatives. And when you lose credibility, and we're all told this by our parents and our teachers growing up as children, trust is very hard to gain. It's very easy to lose, and then once you lose it, it's almost impossible to get back. And this is a problem that the West faces in all regards: politically, militarily, financially. We see these situations with the banks, the whole Western finance system. People have no faith in it anymore because of what they've done recently over the last year or two.
Right. Now, you talked about the financial crisis that's kind of bubbling and building. It seems like Credit Suisse is on its way out and about to merge, and that's a huge deal. That would be just a huge shock to the world economic system. But I wanted to segue to another question of legality, Brian. There has been footage released of this MQ-9 Reaper drone, which was allegedly downed by Russia recently in the Black Sea. And this footage was released to kind of like demonstrate, well, look, Russia actually did down it. Hard to even tell what's happening in that footage, but it's quite clear that Russia was very aware and was looking to address this MQ-9 Reaper drone, this U.S. drone that was flying incredibly close to Crimea. And so I'm wondering what your reaction has been to these developments, because there has been kind of an argument about legality here. The U.S. saying, oh, well, we're in international airspace, we can do what we want. Russia saying, you probably shouldn't be flying this close to us with a potentially armed weapon, a drone. What is your opinion on this? How have you seen these developments transpire for you?
Generally, if you're flying in international airspace or your ships are moving through international waters, then usually everything should be okay. But in this case, the United States is not doing innocent passage. They are there for a reason. They are contributing to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Uh, you were just asking earlier about the U.S. role in all of this. When you are at war with another nation, part of what you are doing every single day is collecting intelligence to help organize forces to target different positions, troops, facilities, infrastructure. And so that is what the U.S. is actually doing on behalf of Ukraine. They are playing that role in the conflict. So they are involved in the conflict, flying that close to Crimea, which has been considered by Russia Russian territory since 2014. There was a referendum, a decisive referendum. And I think it's very hard to even argue about the legitimacy of the referendum, because a U.S. government poll the year before said basically these people want to be part of Russia. They identify as Russian. They want to be part of Russia. So the whole idea of the U.S. bringing their drones that close, even if it wasn't it was in international airspace, but what was it doing there? It wasn't just passing by. It wasn't just doing routine surveillance or again. And think about it: the U.S. is located in North America. It's over 5,000 miles away from the Black Sea. So what is it doing there? And if it was the other way around, if it was Russia or China doing this, even if they were in international airspace, people would see it as unreasonable, unnecessarily provocative. And I saw people online asking, what if Russia and China did this? Isn't that interesting that we don't know? We have to ask that question because Russia and China don't do that. I saw someone say, well, they fly near Alaska, apparently oblivious that Russia is right on the other side of the Bering Strait from Alaska. I mean, that's one thing. That's understandable. If there were Russian drones flying in the Gulf of Mexico, that would be another issue. And I don't think people would see that as reasonable. I don't think what the U.S. was doing was reasonable. Russia has a right to defend itself. There's a drone that is actively participating in hostilities against the Russian Federation. They have a right to defend themselves against it. That's the way I see it, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets to the huge disparity in how the United States, how the collective West talks about their participation in this ongoing conflict in Ukraine versus their reality. The United States constantly says, Joe Biden constantly says, well, we're not real. The Pentagon says, oh, well, we're not real. We're not a party to this conflict. And then they'll say, so on the one side of their mouth, they're saying that. On the other, they're saying, oh, we're going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Right. And that's what they've done. And so you're exactly right, Brian, that the drone, I mean, that is not some kind of benign operation that they're running there. That is all about conducting intelligence, and Russia should be very concerned and has the right to defend itself, as you said, for the sole sake alone that they have been very aware of what the United States has been saying about a place like Crimea. The United States, your take on this, it's like Crimea not only voted to be part of the Russian Federation, but throughout this conflict, there's been a back and forth, especially from the United States, about whether Ukraine should just go and launch an assault on Crimea to take it back. I mean, whether there's disagreement and debate about that, which I do think there's debate about it, nonetheless, it's been something that's been very seriously discussed.
Yeah, well, again, I'll go back to the 2013 USAID and International Republican Institute poll. And the IRI is a subsidiary of the National Endowment for Democracy. And the reason they were conducting this poll was because they fully planned to intervene in Ukraine's internal political affairs. And they wanted to see which way it was going to go in Crimea. And when you look through the poll results, most people identified as either Crimean or Russian. A quarter, this was in 2013, before they really had a reason to, a quarter of the people living there wanted to rejoin Russia. And if they had to join some sort of economic union, the European Union or the customs union, they overwhelmingly wanted to join Russia and its union. So case closed. Those people want nothing to do with the U.S. installed client regime in Kiev. And for the U.S. to say, well, Ukraine should go in there and overrun it and take it over. I mean, they're talking about subjugating people who want nothing to do with the government in Kiev. And that's based on what the U.S., its own poll, revealed. And so that, we always hear about sovereignty and democracy and self-determination. The people of Crimea determined their destiny, and it was with the Russian Federation and the U.S. Encouraging Ukraine to override their self-determination. It demonstrates who is really at the core of this problem, who's really driving this issue, this conflict.